merry-go-round would be interesting kind of going forward. Gerrard, Conte, and that Newcastle position, because that's a job which every manager will be kind of salivating over.
No, Parity, you haven't mentioned yet the obvious source of the money, and a lot of people with a bad taste in their mouth about all this happening. Not the fans, by the way. I think the Supporters Trust did a survey to say that 94% of Newcastle fans were behind this happening. No part of you is a little bit put off by the source of the money?
Oh, it is. Yeah, you've mentioned it there. It does stick in the gut. I'd have to admit that, and it'd be nice. Look, I've mentioned before about the fans and the club, and I'm delighted for them. That's absolutely the case. But I think you can park that to the side. But there is that kind of elephant in the room, and I think it's important it gets kind of referenced. You can talk about generally their kind of the country itself and kind of how they operate and how they treat their citizens, maybe women in particular. But I think if anything kind of encapsulates the issues in regards to how the country is run, it was the murder of that Saudi journalist in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. I mean, that was a pretty despicable, disgusting act, and I think that needs to be referenced. Like, you know, I think anybody who's read it, and I'd be the same as anybody else, a layman just picking up the paper, and I've read as much as anybody else, but pretty kind of sickening what happened there in terms of how that man was lured into the embassy under false pretenses and treated the way he was. So I have a huge amount of sympathy for his family. I think it was his fiancée at the time. He was actually going there, wasn't he, to get papers so he could actually marry his fiancée at the time, and she's walking around. She's obviously trying to fight his case, and you hear quotes for her obviously trying to keep the case in the public kind of spotlight, but not too many people, I don't think, are interested in listening, and we won't hear too much of it over the coming weeks in relation to the Newcastle story. But I think it's important that it is kind of referenced, and people are made aware of it, and I think it'd be nice to see some kind of acknowledgement somewhere, whether it's the Premier League or somewhere else. I don't think
well, I don't know. I think that ship has sailed now almost, hasn't it? Because that was the opportunity the Premier League had to say we don't want to be associated with this regime. And you mentioned that one story there, and it's not an outlier by any stretch of the imagination. You only have to do a very quick Google to figure out that there's plenty of those types of stories about. How do we square all this off, right? Because like we've just spent 15 minutes talking about what's going to happen on the pitch, and that's going to be repeated up and down this country and up and down other countries around the UK and further afield ad infinitum now, right? For as long as this the Saudis are involved in the club. What I'm saying is it's going to move on from conversations around this. It's going to move into a football context. Sportswashing, has been mentioned on this show during the week, works. It's difficult to know exactly how we manage all this when we're previewing Newcastle against Aston Villa, we're previewing Newcastle against Leeds. This stuff just doesn't come up, and suddenly we're talking about all of this in a very positive light.
Yeah, no, it's true. I don't think we can do anything about it. In all honesty, this is where the game's gone. The amount of investment that's coming into the game over the previous whatever it is, like these kind of billionaires and now state-owned football clubs. It's interesting, really. I think one of the criteria for this takeover getting the green light was if I read it correctly, was the fact that the private investment fund from Saudi Arabia was strictly, there was some distance put between that and the actual state itself, as if to say the private investment fund actually existed independently.
Well, it makes no sense, Kenny. It makes no sense. It's 80% of Newcastle is owned by the Saudi State Investment Fund, which is run by Mohammed bin Salman. It makes absolutely no sense at all.
It's almost an admission, the fact that they're trying to create that distance. I know that there are rules about states not being able to own football clubs, and maybe that's the reason, but there's also a washing of the image that's going on here, where it's like they realise that opening up the fact that this is owned by by Saudi Arabia is not a good look, and they're almost very self-aware of what the image is. Like, I mean, the thing is, this is absolutely nothing new. Like when we look at Paris Saint-Germain or Manchester City, I mean, there is a list as long as your arm if you want to go through human rights abuses that are on a par with Saudi Arabia in some respects. And have we forgotten about that, or when it comes to the biggest moments, do we all of a sudden have these conversations more. And I just wonder, how has that changed over the last couple of years? If you're a glass half full person, you could say that, you know, the last day when it was PSG against Manchester City, there were a couple of pieces written about this being a pretty grotesque representation of where modern football is at. On the other hand, you might say, well, actually, everybody's just talking about Lionel Messi, or everybody's just talking about what's going on at Manchester City. And then the big test is obviously going to be at the end of next year when it comes to the Qatar World Cup, and what sort of blowback there is to the price that's been paid on a human level for putting that show on next year. And you suspect that once the games get underway, that will be very much in the rearview mirror, and I think that'll be crystallised in particular when it comes to, you know, a heavy month of football as opposed to a state owning a football club.
Yeah, and there's obviously been deals done behind the scenes there in terms of Qatar and Saudi Arabia in terms of getting this deal over the line, in terms of like the Premier League stream over the past couple of years, being Sports, isn't it, which comes out of Qatar, and there's been issues there with Saudi Arabia in terms of piracy and this and that, and talk of like £1 billion being paid by Saudi Arabia to Qatar to kind of settle that outstanding issue, to kind of smooth the way for this particular takeover. And then of course, you know, there's a lot of politics in that region anyway, isn't there? There's a proxy war being fought over there anyway, Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Yemen anyway, isn't there? So there's all of that, and I wouldn't want to be sitting here making, because I'll be the very same, like I'll walk out this year out today and then that'll be the end of it. You know what I mean, it'll be parked to the back of my head. But I think it's important, these things, they're not going to push under the carpet. Maybe you know, Saudi Arabia, the Mohammed bin Salman, he won't be speaking directly to the camera, but I think it's important these things are kind of spoken about and they're put out there, and you know, some people are held to account over some of the stuff that we've been talking about today. Is it going to change? Probably not. The nature of the beast now, the money's involved, and the Premier League, where it's going, you feel as if the game's almost been taken away from us to a large degree. I think people will accept that. But yeah, I think it's a pretty sad day though. I think if people feel unable to bring these issues to the fore and kind of speak about them in public, or you know, you're reprimanded, or you're kind of dismissed, or you feel as if potentially there's some kind of repercussion if you actually speak out about these things. I think that's probably a pretty dark place we're heading for if that's going to be the case. Like, so we can't change everything overnight, but I think it's important at least people speak out and these things are put out in the public domain and people at least are made aware of them. And maybe, lads, you could make the argument it's a pretty weak one, the fact that Saudi Arabia have taken over Newcastle. Maybe they will be held accountable a little bit more, and maybe they'll have to face up to a few of these kind of criticisms, these questions from people, from journalists, where that may not have been the case previously. So they might have to accept a little bit of responsibility and actually come out publicly and speak and address a few of these things. And maybe in the long term, maybe that might accelerate a little bit of change in some of these countries for the better. Who knows? I mean, it's a pretty weak argument, to be honest.
Well, look, it is a fair point that maybe it has a sort of an about face impact on the source of where this money is coming from, but it is definitely hard to see. Like, you listen to, there was a podcast that was republished again during the week from The Guardian from last year, where a woman whose sister had been imprisoned in the state for basically nothing, including something to do with driving, but she was an activist and she was a voice for women's rights in the country, and she'd been sexually abused after being arrested for no reason, and she was electrocuted, and her sister spoke about the police state nature of the country and no freedom of speech. And then you hear Amanda Staveley yesterday, and she's talking about they're going to do great things for the community in Newcastle, and look, they probably will, but bloody hell, it's just grim. And it ain't going anywhere, and I think it's probably important that we continue to have the conversation, and like Owen says, around the bigger games, because Newcastle are going to be, if this all plays out exactly the way they plan it, they're going to be contending sooner rather than later for Premier League titles and for Champions League titles and all that, the rest of that stuff. So it's important that we continue to have that conversation. Now, and you were going to say something there, were you?
Well, I'm just going to make the point that Manchester City have done that exact thing that Amanda Staveley is promising for Newcastle, that by all accounts the community around Manchester City have actually benefited quite a bit from the financial investment. But that is also part of the sport washing. These people aren't stupid. They know that the community matters when it comes to these football clubs, particularly in the north of England. And investing in the community is just a genius way of helping tap into the sports washing idea. Like, I would say that really when you compare it to, say, Manchester United, like, not that they're in it for sports washing whatsoever, they're in it for a financial gain, it seems. And you can just see it's chalk and cheese when it comes to how the fans look at their ownership.